Hi, and welcome to the next episode of Humans of AI interview series, where together with my guests from academia and business, we try to demystify what AI is and what it's not, hopefully making this whole concept a bit more approachable and digestible. Today, we are welcoming Dr. Ansgar Koene. Dr. Ansgar Koene is the Global AI Ethics and Regulatory Leader at EY. He's also a senior research fellow at the University of Nottingham's Horizon Digital Economy Research Institute. He also chairs the IEEE Standard Development Working Group on Algorithmic Bias Considerations. And he's a trustee for the Five Rights Foundation. And also he sits on the AI Ethics Board for Hayden AI Technologies. So without further ado, welcome Ansgar. Hi Ansgar.
Hi.
Thank you so much for agreeing to this interview.
My pleasure.
I would love to kick off and ask you straight away, how did this journey start? How did this... Babies. How did this... Not mine, outside. How did this journey with AI start?
My journey with AI, it started actually when I was doing my master's degree in electrical engineering control systems. So this is the previous wave of AI. There was been an AI winter between that one and the current. And fuzzy logic as well as artificial neural networks were both areas that were sort of hot at that time.
Crazy baby. Okay. From the very beginning.
Sure.
How did your journey with AI start?
So my journey with AI started when I was doing my master's degree at the Technical University in Delft. So that was back in the previous wave of AI. And the focus areas that I was looking at was actually the combination of artificial neural networks and fuzzy logic, trying to use fuzzy logic. So the idea of describing rules not in hard sort of from this number to that number, but more in general terms like hot or high pressure as opposed to pressure between values X and Y. So using fuzzy logic as a way to make the artificial neural network, what that network has learned, making that more transparent to humans. So really addressing the kind of question that is currently very much in any area of research still about how to explain what has the neural network actually learned. And from that work, I actually transitioned into looking at computational neuroscience, so more at how can we model the way in which the biological brain works. And there my focus was on the sensory motor systems, because that is where we can do direct measurements. So how does visual stimulation lead to eye movements and the neural circuitry between that? From there, I've spent a number of years doing research on the intersection between psychology, neuroscience, and robotics, testing models of how the biological brain works in robots and doing biologically inspired kind of robotics work. More recently, my work has transitioned a bit more into the area around AI governance and ethics questions. This started by looking at data sharing and data usage, such as online data for computational social science and the ethical questions around that. And from there, looking at how this kind of data is being used to shape people's experience of the online world through things like recommender systems, search engines, those kinds of things.
Awesome, thank you so much. So that's why I know that you are a huge advocate of ethical AI, that I love to interview you on that. So as with everything as like powerful as AI, it can be a double-edged sword, right? Things which can be developed for monitoring performance of employees to direct them to do a better job or to improve their own careers. It may very much be used to do like Big Brother situations, right? So with all the infamous cases, such as you know, Cambridge Analytica, what do you think it should be done to prevent companies building such systems?
So one of the interesting things actually that I found in a lot of the discussion around AI ethics and those kinds of questions is that the majority of issues that are being discussed are really ethics of the use of emerging technologies, whether it's AI or any kinds of other
Mhm.
technologies. And often, for instance, when it comes to things like surveillance, abuses of AI for surveillance, a lot of that is actually abuses of Internet of Things for
Mhm.
surveillance and those kinds of
Mhm.
things. It's really the use of technologies, digital technologies primarily, and thinking through what are the societal consequences of doing this. With a lot of the examples where we found that a technology has ended up having negative consequences, like secondary consequences, it's been because the people who've been developing it, they've been thinking about, I'm building this great technology, and if everybody uses it the way that I intended to be used,
Mhm.
then it will be generate all kinds of great outcomes. But the reality is that once you put a tool out there, people will start looking at other ways in which they can
Mhm.
use it. Cambridge Analytica is an example of that. Um, Facebook and other social media, when they initially started and they were looking at how can we use recommender systems and those kinds of
The
things to
bacon.
push certain information
Yeah.
that people will find more relevant, make that more accessible, they were not thinking, how can we use this for um, political manipulation? But it provided a tool that can be used for this, and they did not think through that this is a possibility, and they
Mhm.
did not put in place safeguards against that. So this is very much what a lot of the responsible research and innovation, responsible AI kind of work is about. It's think about what are the potential alternative ways, potential negative uses of the technology. How can we put in place safeguards against that? And also just think about how the technology will impact people who might not be exactly like you yourself. You know,
Mhm.
understand what are the needs of different types of stakeholders in society.
Mhm. Yes, exactly. And but then you have many different levels, right? You have companies, you have individuals, and then you have countries. So some countries may not have the same ethical principles. So what do you think we should do, or if there is anything we can do to live and like have the transparency of data, since we live in interconnected globalized world?
Yeah, that's indeed a challenge, and one of the reasons why it is necessary to be thinking about these things at a global kind of scale. And we see this happening, like the development around industry standards to help guidelines, set out guidelines of what is good best practice for industry. A lot of that work is being done at the international level. National standards organizations working with the international. And we also see in the policy space, OECD and UNESCO, etc., are making efforts to try and facilitate international coordination around this.
Mhm.
But the same as we have even with something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Mhm.
It is universally accepted, but one of the reasons why it is universally accepted is because it is slightly vague in the way in which it is formulated. It uses constructive ambiguity in its language,
Mhm.
which means different countries can interpret it differently. So it, but that also means, of course, that we might not actually be comfortable with using a technology that was used in a different cultural context if it's being exported to us. Um, and that's one of the reasons why in the work that I'm doing, for instance, with the IEEE on standards, we say, you know, you need to be building it with a particular context in mind. And if you are going to deploy your system in a different context, you need to reassess whether the way it currently is built is appropriate for that particular context.
Mhm.
And so for global operating platforms, this means you may have to have regional differences in the way in which you provide your services, and you need to provide transparency to the people who are using it so that they know I'm now interacting with a system that was built for the European context. I'm now interacting with the one that was built for the Chinese context, and you can take that into considerations.
Mhm. So should I understand that you are pro and like heavy regulation, or there should be like a balance? Because there is also a lot of competition, right, between countries, and China is trying to take a lead on it. So there is a lot of talk and a lot of attempts to regulate difficult subjects such as weaponized robots, right, autonomous weapons. And one concern is, as you said, that some of the countries may interpret the laws differently, so they can ignore it. So how worried should be about this international competition?
So as with any other kind of technology that we use, really, the level of kind of regulatory requirements that are put to it have to be in balance with the kind of impact that the technology is having. So that's why I think the core idea of what the European Commission put forward in its recent AI white paper around doing a risk assessment
Mm-hmm.
and you know setting regulatory requirements based on the kind of risk that the AI, this particular application of AI poses, is the right kind of approach to take. I think in the details of what was being proposed in the white paper were could be improved. The exact way in which they were doing the risk assessment, I don't agree with, but the core concept that we take an approach that looks at the particular application of the AI um, and do an assessment of what kind of an impact does it have on the stakeholders. Is this something that will have a significant impact on their lives? Um, and the tricky bit is, in some cases, it can be very clear. It's a strong impact and it's an immediate impact. So, for instance, in an autonomous vehicle, if you have a collision, that's an immediate result of strong impact. But if we're thinking about something, for instance, like the recommender systems in social media, the immediate impact isn't so big. A single recommendation doesn't make that much of an impact. But if you keep doing it, accumulating over time, then, as we've seen with Cambridge Analytica, you can actually have a significant impact on the whole political system of a country. So that makes the risk assessment more difficult. Would you class this? Is this a high risk system or not? Um, so it's a tricky piece of work, and we haven't really completely come out yet with how to do the risk assessments. But I'd say at the core, that is the way to approach it. Do a risk assessment for really no risk kind of applications, and AI that controls the non-player characters in a game. We don't need regulation. Who cares if this thing
Mm-hmm.
misbehaves? Um, but for other applications, there needs to be hard regulations, and for various things in between, soft law may work. So that's standards with certification and those kinds of approaches. So it's basically taking the same approach that we've done for other technologies
Mm-hmm.
and just recognizing that AI is another piece of technology and it needs to be assessed in a similar kind of way.
Okay. And obviously there are different concerns, such as bias and discrimination, right? So how data could be biased and it reinforce some things which we may have not even thought of. How can companies and governments, what can governments do to mitigate some of those risks?
So, I mean, the data that is being used and can be biased in various different ways. And I mean, bias in data has always been a particular kind of issue. Even if you weren't using a machine learning system, you were still feeding data into it to make decisions. Even in a system where humans were making the decision, if they were giving incorrect information about you, they would make the wrong kind of decision. But of course, with machine learning, it becomes more critical because the actual model that it builds around of the world is derived from the data. Um, the kinds of problems, bias that we can find in the data are various. It can be just that you haven't thought about what is actually relevant data for these particular stakeholders. So you're collecting the wrong type of data. It can be that the data that you're collecting is biased because the world that we currently have is not the world that we want to be having. We said we want to have equality between men and women in work, etc. But the reality is that we don't have that at the moment. So if you just mine current data and you use it blindly, then you're going to reinforce the current inequalities. So really what you need to do is you need to do an assessment of the types of data that you have. You need to counteract the inequalities that are in it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it becomes difficult. That's where it becomes an ethical issue, because even we've talked to various companies around this, and they say, well, okay, you know, but if I just use the historical data, then um, I'm I'm a neutral actor in this space. I'm just continuing along what exists. If I take an active role to try to counterbalance historically inequalities, then I'm becoming a active participant in this. I'm the one who's setting what the values are going to be, and that means I start to take responsibility for where it is. And then the question is really, how much responsibility should a company have as opposed to the government have in this kind of space? And an important solution, if you will, in this is almost always you need engagement with the stakeholders who are going to be impacted. You cannot basically operate um, from a distance without engaging the people who will be in, because in various discussions that we've also had, it can be the case that people feel it's not so much the way in which the algorithm classified me that is the problem. It's the fact that I got classified without ever being asked about it.
Mm-hmm.
That is the problem. It's the loss of agency that is happening through these kinds of systems that is really the problem for a lot of people. So stakeholder engagement is a core methodology that I would say is necessary in order to start addressing these issues.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, there are, expanding on that, there are cultural differences, right? So for some nationalities, things which may be accepted or shocking, for example, in Asia, there are some things which we feel strongly about in different way, and vice versa. So how should we tackle this when considering bias in those systems?
Well, this basically goes back to what I've said at an earlier point. Um, Understanding that things are built for a particular context, and you cannot really just apply it in a different context without recalibrating the system to the new environment. I mean, that's sort of at the core of um, a lot of the historical colonial thinking was, we've decided a certain point of view, and that point of view needs to be just applied to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
um, but the proper way of approaching is to say, well, what are the values of the stakeholders in this space, and we need to be adjusting accordingly. Obviously this carries costs with it. It means that you're going to have to do extra work for the system as you're deploying it in different kinds of spaces. But in the long run, I think it will pay back because it will make the system more appealing to the stakeholders that you're engaging with. It will it will be good basically for your reputation, for a lot of the non-tangible kinds of assets that companies have around how they're operating.
Mm-hmm. And I've read, changing subject slightly, I've read that you are also interested in bio-inspired robotics. So there is a lot of coverage, obviously, about bio-inspired therapeutic pet robots, such as those in Japan or in Asia, to care for elderly or those with Alzheimer's. Or the obvious Boston Dynamics and their famous parkour moves, which can be used obviously for logistics. But what are the other examples? What are the other robots you see which can have a huge, or they already have a huge impact on our society?
So some of the kind of bio-inspired robotics, which perhaps might be less immediately obvious, is not in a complete robot kind of system, but you might find in things like visual image recognition systems, so that basically it will look to you like just like any kind of camera, but the way in which the visual processing is being done is inspired by the way in which the human retina and visual cortex operates, so that you can do more rapid parallel processing of the images. I mean, in a sense, a lot of the current revolution in AI, the deep neural networks, is that type of an bio-inspired. And I think it's important to keep in mind that this is inspired by, it is not a close analogy of how the biological system works. The way in which biological neurons work is far more complicated than what we're doing in these systems. Um, so the kinds of bio-inspired work that I've been engaging with has been around these types of, how does action selection work, for instance, or how can you have a robot that will learn different kinds of actions by building on, try to make the system more robust, that in that sense, so that if um, the environment it gets exposed to isn't exactly the same as the one that it was trained in, it will be able to still respond to it, because the core movements that it has are more basic than that. We're seeing some of this coming into at the experimental side in some robots to help elderly, for instance, with providing them with items in their house.
Mm-hmm.
So far, it's still very much in the experimental state, because these systems tend not to be sufficiently robust. They can easily sort of get stuck in that the environment is not quite the way that it was planned for.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there is a potential for these kinds of systems in being able to support the types of work that where we currently have a great shortage of people to actually perform the kinds of tasks.
Correct. And correct me if I'm wrong, but is there anything of this applied to like space robots, or like rover? It can repair itself without like knowing all the conditions up front. Is there anything related with this, or that's another system?
I'm not exactly sure what kind of systems they're using in these rovers. I would imagine that some of the sort of, one of the core types of tasks that a Mars rover of any like that has, what's called simultaneous location and mapping, localization and mapping, SLAM, which is basically exposing, the machine goes into an environment for which it has no pre-existing map. And so while it is moving through it, it needs to create that map, and at the same time, I know where it is in space in order to get somewhere. And this is at its core, the ideas behind that come from the way in which the hippocampal circuitry in mammals also works to try and learn new locations in space. Um, but again, it is more a case of inspired by as opposed to closely emulating, because um, we do some attempts at close emulation in the experimental space, but
Mm-hmm.
that's more because we're trying to test our models of how the brain works. But you're introducing all kinds of complexities that you don't need for the technical system.
Okay. Okay, let's get a bit more philosophical, if you will.
Hmm.
So what do you think about the concept of AI consciousness? If we can build machines that imagine things, that assume our responsibility for their actions and understand ethics, what we want, and compassion, How should we regulate it, if we should regulate it?
So for starters, I am a materialist in the sense that all consciousness resides in the biology of the brain. So there is no fundamental reason why it shouldn't be possible to create this in a
Mhm,
robot. However, I don't see that our current approaches will lead to this. I don't believe that simply building a larger and larger deep neural network or something like that will lead to um, an actual proper kind of consciousness, because we see our systems currently, they don't understand anything. They can make correlations and
mhm,
respond to that, but they don't understand what they're dealing with. But assuming that we have achieved some kind of conscious robotics, um, I think an important point is there to realize that once you've gotten to the point of getting something towards consciousness, you've moved away from building a tool to creating something that has basically the qualities of a life form. And so you need to be thinking about it differently. You are not just building something to use for a particular kinds of purpose. If it is truly conscious, it will have desires of wanting to do certain kinds of things. And if you were to then impose that it cannot do these things, that it must do what you want it to do, then effectively you're going down the road of slavery. And this would not be acceptable. So the way in which to deal with an actual conscious AI is one that moves much more towards thinking about how do we deal with other humans, or certainly um, with any kind of higher, more conscious kind of other animals as well. So it would be an interesting space to work in, but really, I think the question is, once we go in that direction, why why are we doing this? Why do we want to have a conscious kind of robot? And obviously, the answer cannot be simply because it would be better at performing a certain task, because then we're talking about a tool which shouldn't be having consciousness.
yes, but as you know, humans are curious, so they always try to break systems and do things which um, don't seem like a good idea in the end. So let's go back maybe to something more achievable. So emotions. As you know, there are lots of companies which are trying to teach machines to like respond to humans, understand their emotions. For example, Affectiva, whose CEO I had actually pleasure to interview as well. So since those companies are trying to detect and react to human emotions, hoping to humanize the technology and improve also the ways we connect with each other as humans, right? Do you think it's important to focus on that, or do you think it's going to help humans, or it's going to alienate us further?
I think there can be good uses for trying to understand better what the emotional state is of the person that the system is interacting with. It is important from an ethical point of view, however, to make sure that this is just understanding the emotional state in order to better respond to it. It's not about trying to respond in an emotional way to try to um, impart an emotional bond towards a machine that is basically um, not appropriate to the level of actual consciousness that this machine has. And so in a sense, if we were to, in our previous part, if it was an actual conscious machine, then having an emotional tie to it is fine. It probably is a good thing. Um, if, however, we're basically talking about a glorified calculator, um, putting things on it in order to trigger an emotional response to it is basically it's misleading people,
Mhm,
and could be used to also lead them into things that, it's a strong form of nudging that has the potential to also be abused.
mhm,
However, just the act of understanding what the emotional state is can be quite important for various types of applications. for helping people who might be vulnerable emotionally, or also just, you know, if a person is engaging with a task that has the potential to cause harm if done incorrectly, then we might want to monitor whether their emotional state is such that they should be engaging with this at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and as we already mentioned, it's very good for areas of societies which are aging, and there is simply not enough people to take care of everyone. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the potential impact of jobs on jobs, impact on of AI and the emerging technology as a whole. So it's said that, you know, the repetitive, low-skilled jobs are the first to go, and due to automation. But the jobs which seem safe are the ones involving more of a creative or like emotional side, like human-oriented jobs. How do you think the world will look like when AI catches up on the emotional level, like the glorified calculator will be strong enough? Um, or maybe it's wrong question and we should look at it in another way.
Um, so I think one of the things that's going to be interesting to see is what actually classifies as a complicated, difficult task to automate as opposed to what doesn't, because the way we've traditionally thought about this is a high skill task and this is a low skill task has been very much about intellectual kind of prowess that you would need to. You'd need to have achieved, you know, gone to university or something. In that case, it is a high skilled kind of task. However, if we look at the, you know, what are machines good at, it's not about whether it is intellectual or not, but rather whether it is something that has a clearly confined pattern to it. And so you can get what would traditionally be considered more intellectual types of tasks, such as certain types of journalism, like sports journalism or something, that actually have quite a fixed pattern to them in how this kind of reporting happens, which can already, to a large extent, be automated.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Whereas we have other kinds of tasks, like a lot of the work on a construction site, which have not been considered to be intellectual, but are actually incredibly difficult for robots to do, because a construction site is not a structured environment. It has so many irregularities in it that you need to be able to flexibly respond to. So it'll be interesting to see which kinds of jobs actually get more automated and how that might shift our appreciation of human skills that are involved in these kinds of tasks.
Mm-hmm. So the future, I imagine, is the one where you have augmented intelligence, right? Like in computers, machines helping humans to perform their jobs better. And if, assuming that we get rid of all those boring jobs, as we say, do you think we could live in a more harmonious, like way of living, or instead of like competition-based society, or it's not going to have an impact on us as a society?
Um, there is a potential that it might have an impact in that kind of direction, but I don't think that would necessarily be because of um, the, I don't know what kind of methodology, but the sort of the melding of the digital tools and the humans. I think it's more to do with the level to which our societies are able to produce effectively surplus and give us the freedom to think more about how to do an equitable distribution of resources, basically reducing scarcity in order to make it easier to um, provide the necessary what's necessary to everyone. Um, to a large extent, we are actually already at a stage where we could be doing a lot more of that than we currently are doing. It has more to do with political will than it does with actual availability of resources at this stage. Um, and to that, I don't necessarily see that augmentation will shift political will in one way or the other as such. It can become a terrible dystopia in which augmentation gets used to force people to do all kinds of things, or it can go in the other direction in which these kinds of things are used to facilitate an easy distribution of resources and go more towards the utopia direction. It is really down to political will,
Mhm.
and that requires, I would say, our engagement with, thinking about our responsibilities when developing these kinds of technologies and any other kind of technologies, basically shifting towards more of uh, an approach to anything that we're doing that involves more of a thinking of what are the consequences for the wider society and environment, not just my own immediate rewards that I can get from doing it. And I'm hopeful that we are moving in that direction. Some of this movement is um, by force because we've pushed things like environmental degradation to the point where if we don't respond in a more responsible way,
Everyone
we're going to have big problems.
yeah.
Um, but hopefully we will learn a bigger lesson from that and be able to shift the political will.
So we should just wait and see. Natural selection will have its way as well. So expanding on that, going back to philosophical ideas. So if most of our jobs are automated, and we can choose to work, you already touched on that a bit. How do you think it will impact people's satisfaction and the happiness, right? So if we assume that jobs bring satisfaction and finding your purpose of life is closely related to what you do professionally, do you think people will have a trouble in finding purpose and meaning?
Well, I guess this comes down to the question about how do we allow people to take on certain kinds of tasks. So at this moment, because um, you need to be engaging in some form of profit generating or something like that in order to justify you're doing this kind of task. Um, that means you need to be at a certain level of skill in order for what you're doing to be valued enough. Um, and we get more sort of competition between people. Hopefully, if our resources are big enough and being distributed well enough, um, that should no longer apply. We would be able to engage in the kind of activity that we consider to be fulfilling, um, and the outcomes that we are producing can be appreciated by others, even if our skill level is not like the skill level of a certain kind of other person. It is still producing something uniquely from us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because the types of systems that are being automated are the ones that are the routine, the things that are fixed of things, what we'll find is that a lot of what humans are adding to or big changes, the unique aspects to it, and as such, everyone will have their own uniqueness that they contribute to it. But a core question is really how can we shift our sense of this as a valued contribution
Mm-hmm.
if it isn't measured by something like monetary reward, which comes from scarcity and those kinds of elements. We need a different way of appreciating uh, the things that people are doing. This is going to be probably a big learning curve for society, but hopefully it's something that we can start engaging with sooner rather than later.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any idea, any vision on how it could look like?
Well, an obvious first kind of step towards this, and which has been experimented on in various places, is the universal basic income kind of an
My next
approach of
question.
um, saying we will provide everybody with the core necessities that they have so that you are not forced to take on a job just because you need to be able to make a living. You can actually say, I don't think what this job offers is good. I think that this is not ethical. And I have, because of the UBI, I have the space to be able to say, I reject this, I won't engage with it. And then that will allow people to actually put that kind of pressure on. Because if you are trying to do something and the types of jobs that you are offering are of a quality that nobody would want to do it under a UBI kind of space, you're not going to find anybody to engage with it. Whereas under the current environment, there's usually somebody who's desperate enough to need to pick it up.
Mhm. Okay, let's go back a bit on to the idea of the general AI, the super intelligent machine, which has capability to understand and learn any intellectual task. How do you think we will arrive there, and do you think um, that's where the AI is going to become something different than only a tool, or this is not where we are heading?
I think the thought experiment around singularity and superintelligence that self improves itself and exponentially becomes faster, it's an interesting thought experiment, but I think it misses a certain element, which is physical reality. And with that, I mean, there's only a certain extent to which you can continue improving yourself through purely theoretical thought experiments. At some point, if you're wanting to become more intelligent, as in having a better understanding of the world, you need to start engaging with the world. You need to do actual physical experiments. You need to actually physically enhance the size of computing power that you have, which requires engaging with real world energy and real world material. Um, and so those are things that you cannot accelerate because you have a faster computing capability. The speed of a chemical reaction is the speed that it is. You cannot make that faster simply because you were thinking faster. And so that is something which I find these thought experiments around the AI superintelligence have tended to completely ignore, which is one of the reasons why I don't actually believe in that scenario. Yes, you will be able to accelerate to a certain kind of point, but then you will start hitting physical boundaries around this. And will this lead to something like consciousness? Well, the way in which we formulated the concept of this acceleration is sufficiently vague that potentially the answer is yes, because we haven't specified what kind of a process this is that is being doing it. If we think that process is simply using our current methods of deep learning, like let's say the AlphaGo
Mhm.
algorithm were to be just enhanced with more processors and exposed to more stimuli, I think we would very quickly find that it doesn't really improve much further, because at its core, it can only do a certain limited types of thing. And one of the core limitations of these systems is the human needs to tell it what the task is. The human needs to define what is success and what is failure. AlphaGo could learn because the rules of the game were predefined. And the win condition was predefined. There was a way for the system through trial and error and other kinds of methodologies to find patterns of behavior, um, because there was a pre-described way of evaluating those behaviors. But if you're starting to expose the system to the real world, in which the predefined evaluations is basically the physical laws, but beyond that, you know, how do I decide whether I should be with this interview or doing something else? There is no external rule that tells me that was the correct action, that was not. And that's really something where our current systems, there's no a way of approaching this kind of space yet. And if we look at robotics, which is the space where you're engaging with the real world,
Mhm.
um, we find robotics. Most videos of robots behaving will stop at a certain point that isn't very long, because a couple of seconds after that, the robot crashed.
Mhm.
Um, or you will see it successfully hitting something or that, which is take 530 out of it was the one case where it worked.
Mhm.
Um, Dealing with the real world is just so much more complicated than dealing with a simulation.
Mhm. But I'm sure you agree that with all this progress, there are some things which may like make us worry, if there is any. Like, do you think we should? Is there anything like specific we should be more like educating ourselves or like looking, watching? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. We don't need to go into any kind of super intelligence to reach a point where the use of these types of technologies can lead to problems.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I don't remember who said it, but there was a very nice quote about the problem isn't super intelligence, but super stupidity. These systems are um, very good at doing something, but they are incredibly stupid because they don't understand what they're doing. So they're just going to keep doing it even when the context has changed. Um, or, for instance, one of the big challenges that we're seeing with machine learning systems is that the system will appear to be doing the right task because in the training data that gave a high accuracy score, but in reality, it isn't doing this task. It has hacked the problem space. It is doing a different task that just happened to give the right kind of responses on these test cases. But once we then expose it to something else, it starts behaving completely erratically because it wasn't doing the right kind of task. And for instance, in the case of autonomous vehicles, we've seen where where the problems if the system, but the test data set wasn't completely vetted the right kind of way. So it appeared to be recognizing traffic signs, but in reality was recognizing something else in the image. Then you expose it to the real world, that something else isn't there. So now it totally doesn't recognize the traffic sign and it's just going to cause a problem. Um, but the main issue really is that we're just using these kinds of technologies at scale. And so any kind of a problem that might be there will also occur at scale, um, and potentially in contexts where it wasn't supposed to be doing. So this comes back to really the issue of introducing responsible design as a approach, where you need to be thinking not just about if I use this in the intended context and the intended way, but what happens if it gets used slightly differently? Is it vulnerable to abuse of other things? And have I really understood the people, the situation that is being going to be used in, or have I just assumed that everybody is like myself, um, and therefore I'm completely biased in the way I've built my system? And the third part, or I don't know, I haven't counted how many parts they're doing, but the next big area is what are the underlying assumptions or motivations that go into how we're building these systems. If we looked at a lot of the cases that have been discussed of problematic systems, such as the use of automated decision making for things like social benefits allocation and those types of things, the underlying problem isn't so much the technology as it is the underlying agenda that was in place when the technology was introduced. The agenda was to cut the how many payouts of unemployment benefit, etc. there are. So the system is built to find ways to reduce that. And then it's automated, so there's no human that can reevaluate whether this particular case is appropriate or not. And you basically get a system that will um, unfeelingly pursue this kind of an agenda. I mean, this is what was at the core of the UN Special Rapporteur's report on uh, um, extreme poverty and the use of AI technologies for these kinds of things. So there's various dimensions at which the use of today's level of AI kinds of systems is already causing issues,
Mm-hmm.
and these need to be addressed through careful approaches and through improved regulation. And to a large extent, it isn't actually building new regulation, it's making sure that the regulators that already exist in various domains have the skills to understand how these systems work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks so much. And I'm not conscious of time, so I'll just choose the last one. So where do you think the whole AI as an industry, as a technology, is heading? And should we be hopeful?
I think actually where AI as an industry is heading is that it's going to gradually become just another tool.
Mhm.
It's going to be similar to when electricity was first introduced. Everything would have a label on it, electric so and so, because that was the big new thing. And everybody had to be concerned about the new dangers that come with electricity, but also the new kinds of things with that. But eventually now, well, that's just what we use. And it's just a useful part of our toolkit of ways in which to build things, build applications to help us achieve things that we want to do. And I think AI is going to go in that direction. It's just going to become another tool in our growing toolkit of methods of building things. And at the same time, we will become accustomed to how to evaluate its performance, how to do the safety checks, how to do the vetting of the data sets and those kinds of questions that are needed. So I'm hopeful that it will become something that basically blends into the background of all of our other kinds of technologies and becomes something that can help us achieve better ways of doing things. And of course, occasionally it would also be used for negative ways of doing things, such same as electricity is also used to deliberately execute people, and those kinds of things. And so we need to constantly be vigilant regarding those things.
Mm-hmm. Just to add on that, because yesterday I had another interview with a professor who said that we are heading for the AI winter, and she's very much concerned that it's not going to progress any further. So you don't think so? Like, you think it's just going to be developed as a, like, more and more, but like in a sphere of a tool?
Um, there may be an AI winter in the sense of AI as a research field, or as a field that is particularly attracting funding and resources to be able to do work in. It is absolutely true that we've been going through the hype cycle, and there's been a lot of um, talk about capabilities of this technology which it has not been able to live up to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that inevitably leads to certain disappointment and therefore reductions of funding that goes into it. Um, but that's more the cycle of funding that goes into the research and those kinds of things. The technology itself is not going to disappear because of that. We might end up renaming it, same as we've
Mm,
renamed a lot of things that used to be called big data
mhm,
to AI, and
mhm,
then they're going to get renamed to something else, or they will just simply be another thing that is being used. It's part of your coding toolbox. Um, where it is useful, it will continue to be used. I mean, our machine translation tools are vastly better than they used to be. Our computer vision things are vastly better than they used to be. That is not going to go away. It may be the case that we will see a dip in funding, especially if a different emerging technology will start to uh, pull that funding to itself.
mhm,
Um, and then and that might actually, it might be a good thing, because one of the things that we've seen with this current kind of wave has been that particular ways of doing AI, such as deep learning, because they produce certain high profile outcomes, especially things like AlphaGo in winning Go, um, that has had such it's given so much momentum to that particular technology that we haven't really stepped back to think about what are the other ways in which we could approach, you know, AI types of problems.
mhm,
Is there perhaps something better that we could be using? Should we be thinking more about hybrid systems that combine machine learning with rule-based approaches and those types of things? So to a certain level, a bit of a dip in the hype and the funding that goes with it is potentially a good thing to get more creative thinking outside of the box, not just do the same thing with more compute power and more data behind it.
mhm. More everything. So, what do you see if not if AI it's going to stop being a hype? What do you see up and coming? Or is there there is anything yet, or it's not yet on the radar?
Well, in the computing space, quantum computing is obviously something that will become a very important area. I'm not sufficiently in that area to know how close it is to really getting to the tipping point of showing big results that will attract lots of funding. Um, Within also sort of in the computing data space, there is currently a lot of uh, rethinking going around about how do we actually do handling of data sets, the try to move away from the centralized databases and the centralized cloud into decentralized edge computing, localized computing. How can we do um, partial learning that where only the extracted models then combine as opposed to sharing of the actual core data? Um, those have potential to become a big thing. Again, I don't know exactly how far they have progressed. I recently read that there was um, a first successful use of homomorphic encryption methodologies. So the idea behind homomorphic encryption is that you can do the computation on the data without ever decrypting the data,
Hmm.
which is it's been a theoretical idea for a while, and its components of that have been at work, but only recently has it been possible to really put that to use in for a serious type of application. So that might become quite important for the privacy
Hmm.
and also data security kind of area. On itself, it probably isn't enough to become a new big core area like AI has been. Um, but there's various things that are in that space of how to do more data privacy respective kinds of technologies that together may become a new big thing. But I'm not really a person who's been exploring what is the next big thing. I've been focusing on how do we do this thing, the AI, in a more responsible kind of way.
That's okay. You've shared a lot of knowledge around ethical AI and other areas we've discussed. So thank you so much for that. And our interview will be live in 3 weeks' time, but
Mhm.
I will share with you everything upfront.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ansgar. Have a lovely evening.
You too.
Bye.
Bye bye.